In a world where assumptions can kill and first impressions often become final judgments, one woman carried a secret so profound that when it was finally revealed, it didn't just change how people saw her, it changed how they saw themselves. For 3 years, Sarah Chen walked the sterile corridors of Metropolitan General Hospital, her footsteps echoing against polished floors as colleagues nodded politely, patients smiled weakly, and supervisors barely acknowledged her presence. To everyone around her, she was simply another face in scrubs, another pair of hands maintaining the endless machinery that keeps a hospital running. They saw her organizing supplies, checking equipment, troubleshooting technical problems with the calm efficiency of someone who knew their place in the grand scheme of things. But what they didn't see was the weight she carried, not just in her quiet demeanor or the careful way she chose her words, but in the small, almost invisible mark that lived beneath her collar. A mark that represented 7 years of hell, 7 years of making impossible decisions, 7 years of holding lives in her hands while explosions shattered the world around her. What happens when the person everyone overlooks turns out to be the one person who could save them all? What happens when the quiet technician in the corner has seen more trauma, made more life or death decisions, and carried more responsibility than the entire medical staff combined? This is the story of how one moment of crisis stripped away all pretenses, all assumptions, all comfortable lies we tell ourselves about who matters and who doesn't. This is the story of how Sarah Chen went from invisible to indispensable in the span of a heartbeat, and how that transformation revealed truths that no one was prepared to face. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in the most ordinary places. Sometimes the hero you're looking for has been standing right next to you all along. And, sometimes, it takes a disaster to show us who people really are beneath the masks we make them wear. Sarah Chen had perfected the art of being invisible. In the bustling corridors of Metropolitan General Hospital, she moved like a shadow, her navy blue scrubs blending seamlessly with the dozens of other support staff who kept the massive medical facility functioning. At 32, she had spent 3 years walking these halls, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the polished linoleum floors. Every morning at 6:15, Sarah would badge in through the employee entrance, grab her coffee from the break room vending machine, and make her way to the biomedical equipment department. Her workstation was tucked away in a corner of the basement level, surrounded by the humming machinery that most people preferred to forget existed. Ventilation systems, backup generators, water treatment facilities, and the endless array of medical devices that required constant maintenance and calibration. The other employees knew her as the quiet Asian woman who fixed things. When an 4-pump malfunctioned on the cardiac unit, they called Sarah. When the ventilators in the ICU needed recalibration, Sarah appeared with her toolkit and methodical approach. When the surgical lights in operating room 7 flickered during a procedure, the nurses would simply say, "Get the tech," and, within minutes, Sarah would slip in, identify the problem, and solve it without disrupting the surgery in progress. Dr. Marcus Webb, the chief of emergency medicine, had probably seen Sarah 100 times but couldn't have picked her out of a lineup. To him, she was part of the hospital's infrastructure, as essential and invisible as the electrical system or the plumbing. The nurses appreciated her efficiency but rarely engaged in conversation beyond the professional necessities. "The oxygen concentrator in room 314 is acting up," they would tell her, and she would nod, gather her tools, and disappear to solve the problem. Sarah's supervisor, Tom Richardson, was a pleasant enough man who ran the biomedical department with the casual authority of someone who had been doing the same job for 20 years. He valued Sarah's work ethic and reliability, often commenting to his wife that he wished all his technicians were as dependable as the quiet woman in the corner. But, even Tom, who worked with Sarah daily, knew surprisingly little about her background. During lunch breaks, while other employees gathered in the cafeteria to share stories about their families, their weekends, their plans for the future, Sarah would eat alone at her workstation or take a walk around the hospital's exterior grounds. She had developed a routine that kept her occupied but isolated, present but apart from the social fabric that bound the rest of the staff together. The truth was that Sarah had become an expert at managing conversations. When someone asked about her background, she would deflect with questions about their own experiences. When the topic of families came up, she would mention her elderly mother in California and change the subject. When colleagues complained about the stress of their jobs, she would listen sympathetically and offer practical solutions without ever revealing what real stress looked like. Her apartment, a modest one-bedroom unit 15 minutes from the hospital, reflected the same careful neutrality as her professional persona. Clean, organized, functional. The walls were decorated with generic landscape prints that had come with the furnished rental. Her bookshelf contained technical manuals, a few popular novels, and, surprisingly, several advanced medical textbooks that she kept spine inward, their titles hidden from casual observation. In her bedroom closet, buried beneath winter clothes and forgotten seasonal decorations, was a single cardboard box that Sarah never opened anymore. Inside that box were photographs, commendations, letters from family she had helped, and a small collection of items that most people would find unremarkable but that contained entire lifetimes of meaning. A bent stethoscope. A tactical flashlight with scratches along its aluminum casing. A notebook filled with careful handwriting documenting procedures, observations, and decisions made under circumstances that most people couldn't imagine. But the most significant item in that hidden box was also the smallest, a small rectangular pin, no larger than a postage stamp, with 7 stars arranged in a specific pattern around a medical cross. The Medic 7 designation, awarded to military medics who had served in the most challenging combat zones, who had demonstrated exceptional skill under the most extreme circumstances, who had made decisions that civilian medical personnel would never face. Sarah's days at Metropolitan General followed a predictable pattern that she found comforting in its routine stability. Morning equipment checks, responding to service calls, preventive maintenance, documentation, and the occasional emergency repair that required her to work quickly and efficiently while medical procedures continued around her. She had become skilled at reading the rhythms of hospital life, understanding the subtle signs that indicated when units were under stress, when equipment failures might have serious consequences, when her invisible presence was most crucial. The emergency department was particularly challenging because of its unpredictable nature. Sarah had learned to position herself strategically during busy periods, anticipating equipment failures before they occurred. She could tell by the sound of a monitor's alarm pattern whether it was a minor calibration issue or a serious malfunction. She could assess the condition of a patient transport gurney by the way it rolled down the corridor. These were skills that had been developed over years of intense training and real-world application, but, in her current role, they were simply part of being a thorough technician. Dr. Amanda Foster, one of the emergency department residents, had noticed Sarah's unusual competence but hadn't thought much about it beyond appreciating her reliability. During particularly chaotic shifts, Dr. Foster had observed that Sarah seemed to anticipate problems before they became critical, appearing with replacement equipment or alternative solutions just when they were needed most. But the emergency department was a place where everyone was focused on immediate patient care, and there was rarely time to consider the deeper implications of why the biomedical technician seemed to understand medical urgency so intuitively. The nursing staff had similar experiences with Sarah. Veteran nurses like Patricia Henley, who had worked in intensive care for 15 years, had developed an appreciation for Sarah's quiet efficiency. Unlike some technicians who would fix equipment problems without considering the broader context, Sarah seemed to understand the medical implications of equipment failures. When she replaced a faulty monitor in the ICU, she would quietly mention to the nurses which backup monitoring systems were available and how to access them quickly if needed. But even Patricia, who prided herself on reading people and understanding the dynamics of hospital life, saw Sarah's knowledge as simply the result of being a very good technician who paid attention to how her equipment was used. The possibility that Sarah's understanding came from a completely different kind of experience never occurred to her. Sarah's invisibility was both a choice and a consequence of how institutions like hospitals function. Medical facilities are hierarchical environments where everyone has a clearly defined role, and people generally stay within those boundaries. Doctors make medical decisions, nurses provide patient care, technicians maintain equipment, administrators handle logistics. This system works efficiently because it allows for specialization and clear lines of responsibility, but it also creates barriers that prevent people from seeing beyond their immediate roles and relationships. For Sarah, this institutional blindness had become a form of protection. She had learned to navigate within the narrow confines of her assigned role, contributing significantly to the hospital's functioning while avoiding the scrutiny that might lead to uncomfortable questions about her background. She had mastered the art of being essential without being noticed, valuable without being visible. The other biomedical technicians in her department were pleasant colleagues who appreciated her willingness to take on difficult assignments and her ability to solve problems that stumped them. Jake Martinez, who specialized in imaging equipment, would often ask Sarah's opinion on challenging repairs because she had a knack for seeing solutions that others missed. Lisa Wong, who handled the surgical equipment maintenance, had noticed that Sarah was particularly skilled with the more sophisticated devices that required understanding of both mechanical and physiological principles. But even her closest professional relationships remained surface level. Sarah had become adept at steering conversations toward technical topics, sharing knowledge about equipment and procedures while revealing nothing about how she had acquired such comprehensive understanding. Her colleagues assumed she had received excellent training in her biomedical engineering program, or that she had worked at other hospitals with more advanced equipment, or that she was simply one of those naturally gifted technicians who understood complex systems intuitively. The truth was far more complex and far more remarkable than anyone imagined. Sarah's knowledge came from 7 years of military service as a combat medic in some of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan and Iraq. She had learned to maintain and operate medical equipment under conditions that would test the limits of human endurance and skill. She had performed emergency medical procedures in situations where the nearest hospital was hundreds of miles away and the only resources available were what she could carry in her field medical pack. But, more than the technical skills, Sarah had developed something that civilian medical facilities rarely provide: the ability to make critical decisions under extreme pressure, to prioritize patients when resources are limited, to remain calm and focused when everything around her was chaos. These were capabilities that had been forged in circumstances that most people would find unimaginable, refined through experiences that had tested not just her medical knowledge but her courage, judgment, and determination. The Medic 7 designation represented the highest level of combat medical training, awarded to medics who had demonstrated exceptional performance in the most challenging situations. It meant that Sarah had not only saved lives under fire but had also trained other medics, developed innovative procedures for treating trauma in field conditions, and made command decisions about medical resource allocation during complex military operations. Yet none of this was visible to her colleagues at Metropolitan General. They saw a competent technician who was perhaps unusually thorough and knowledgeable, but they had no framework for understanding that they were working alongside someone whose medical experience encompassed situations that none of them had ever faced or would ever be prepared to handle. As Sarah finished her shift on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, checking the final items off her maintenance schedule and preparing to head home to her quiet apartment, she had no way of knowing that within 48 hours, everything would change. The carefully constructed barriers between her past and present were about to collapse, and the invisible woman who had spent 3 years hiding in plain sight was about to become the most visible person in the entire hospital. The first sign that Thursday was going to be different came at 5:30 in the morning, when Sarah's emergency pager buzzed with an unusual code. As the senior biomedical technician on call, she occasionally received after-hours alerts for critical equipment failures, but this code indicated a hospital-wide emergency status that she had never seen before. Sarah arrived at Metropolitan General to find the usually orderly morning routine completely disrupted. Emergency vehicles lined the circular drive leading to the main entrance, their red and blue lights creating an urgent strobe effect against the gray dawn sky. Paramedics wheeled gurneys through the automatic doors with the kind of controlled urgency that indicated something far beyond the typical medical emergency. Inside the hospital, the emergency department had been transformed into something resembling a battlefield triage center. Every trauma bay was occupied, additional stretchers lined the corridors, and medical staff moved with the focused intensity that comes only during genuine crises. Sarah badged in and headed immediately to her supervisor's office, where Tom Richardson was coordinating with department heads throughout the hospital. Chemical plant explosion about 40 miles north of the city, Tom explained, not looking up from his computer screen where emergency protocols scrolled past in rapid succession. Some kind of industrial accident around midnight. We're getting the worst cases because we're the only level 1 trauma center within a 100-mile radius. They're expecting another 30 patients within the next 2 hours. Sarah absorbed this information while mentally cataloging the additional equipment demands such an influx would create. Mass casualty events placed enormous strain on hospital resources, particularly the sophisticated medical devices required for treating multiple critical patients simultaneously. As the senior biomedical technician, she would be responsible for ensuring that every piece of life support equipment functioned perfectly when lives depended on it. The chemical plant explosion had occurred at the Meridian Industrial Complex, a facility that manufactured agricultural chemicals and industrial solvents. The initial blast had been followed by a series of secondary explosions as various chemical storage tanks ruptured and ignited. First responders had evacuated a 2-mile radius around the plant due to concerns about toxic gas exposure, and the injured included not only plant workers but also residents from nearby communities and several firefighters who had been caught in the secondary blasts. By 7 o'clock, Metropolitan General had activated its disaster response protocols. The hospital's incident command system designated specific roles and responsibilities for managing the crisis, and Sarah found herself assigned to a mobile equipment support team that would move throughout the hospital, ensuring that critical medical devices remained operational despite the unprecedented demand being placed on them. The types of injuries arriving at the hospital were unlike anything Sarah had seen during her 3 years in the biomedical department. Severe burns, chemical exposure, blast injuries, smoke inhalation, and complex trauma cases that required immediate intervention and continuous monitoring. The emergency department had expanded into adjacent areas of the hospital, turning conference rooms and administrative spaces into temporary treatment areas equipped with portable medical devices. Dr. Webb, the chief of emergency medicine, was coordinating patient flow and treatment priorities from a command post that had been established in the hospital's main conference room. Sarah could see him through the glass walls, surrounded by computer screens displaying patient information, resource allocation charts, and communication links with other regional hospitals. The stress was visible on his face as he made rapid-fire decisions about which patients could be treated locally and which needed to be transferred to specialized burn centers or other facilities. Sarah's first major challenge came when the surge of patients overwhelmed the hospital's ventilator capacity. The ICU normally operated with 12 ventilators, but the chemical explosion had resulted in numerous patients with respiratory complications requiring mechanical breathing support. By 9 o'clock, every available ventilator in the hospital was in use, and additional patients were arriving who would need respiratory support to survive. Working with the respiratory therapy team, Sarah quickly identified several pieces of equipment that could be converted for emergency ventilator use. Anesthesia machines from the operating rooms could be reconfigured to provide mechanical ventilation for patients who didn't require surgical intervention. Transport ventilators normally used for moving patients between facilities could be pressed into service for less critical cases. Even some advanced sleep study equipment could be modified to provide basic respiratory support. But converting equipment required more than technical knowledge, it required understanding of the medical implications of each modification, the physiological needs of different types of patients, and the clinical judgment to determine which compromises were acceptable in an emergency situation. Sarah found herself making decisions that went far beyond her official job description, recommendations that directly affected patient care and treatment outcomes. As she worked to expand the hospital's respiratory support capacity, Sarah began to notice something that troubled her deeply. The medical staff was operating under enormous stress, making decisions quickly based on limited information, and the usual safety checks and verification procedures were being compressed or skipped entirely in the urgency to treat as many patients as possible. Dr. Foster, the emergency department resident, was working on her 18th consecutive hour when Sarah observed her attempting to intubate a patient with chemical burns to his airway. The standard laryngoscope blade wasn't providing adequate visualization due to the patient's injuries, and Dr. Foster was struggling with the procedure while the patient's oxygen levels continued to drop. Sarah could see that the doctor needed a different approach, but offering medical advice was far outside her role as a biomedical technician. The situation crystallized the fundamental challenge Sarah had been managing for 3 years. Her training and experience had prepared her to handle exactly these types of medical emergencies, but her official position limited her to maintaining equipment while watching medical personnel struggle with problems she could easily solve. The artificial boundaries created by hospital hierarchy were preventing her from contributing her most valuable skills precisely when they were most desperately needed. Throughout the morning, Sarah continued to encounter situations where her combat medical experience could have improved patient outcomes, but her role as a technician prevented her from acting on that knowledge. She watched residents make decisions about patient prioritization that reflected their limited experience with mass casualty events. She observed nurses struggling with procedures that were routine in military field medicine but rarely encountered in civilian hospitals. She saw equipment being used in ways that were functional but suboptimal, reducing the effectiveness of treatment and potentially compromising patient safety. The frustration was becoming overwhelming, but Sarah had spent 3 years building her invisible professional identity, and she couldn't simply abandon that carefully constructed persona without consequences. Revealing her medical background would raise questions about why she had chosen to work as a technician, why she had never mentioned her military service, why she had allowed medical personnel to struggle with problems she could have solved. The explanation would require her to confront aspects of her past that she had been deliberately avoiding. By noon, the hospital had received 43 patients from the chemical plant explosion, with more expected throughout the afternoon. The emergency department was operating beyond capacity, the ICU had expanded into the cardiac care unit, and additional patients were being treated in converted spaces throughout the hospital. Every piece of medical equipment was being used to its maximum capacity, and Sarah had been running continuous maintenance checks to prevent failures that could prove catastrophic given the current patient load. The stress on the hospital's systems was becoming evident in ways that went beyond equipment capacity. The nursing staff was exhausted from working extended shifts, the physicians were making decisions about patient care with limited time for consultation and reflection, and the support staff was struggling to maintain the logistical systems that kept the hospital functioning. Sarah could see the signs of an organization being pushed beyond its operational limits, and she knew from experience that such situations often led to cascading failures that could transform a manageable crisis into a genuine disaster. The moment that changed everything began with what appeared to be a routine equipment malfunction. At 12:45, Sarah received an urgent call to the ICU where one of the converted ventilators had developed an irregular breathing pattern. The machine was supporting a 15-year-old girl who had been caught in the chemical plant explosion while walking home from school. She had severe lung damage from inhaling toxic gases, and any interruption in her mechanical ventilation could be fatal. Sarah arrived at the ICU to find the respiratory therapist and the attending physician struggling to understand why the ventilator was delivering inconsistent volumes of air. The machine's diagnostic systems indicated that it was functioning normally, but the patient's oxygen levels were fluctuating in a way that suggested inadequate ventilation. The medical team was preparing to disconnect the patient from the malfunctioning equipment and switch to a backup ventilator, but all the backup units were already in use supporting other critical patients. As Sarah examined the equipment, she quickly identified the problem. The converted anesthesia machine was functioning correctly from a technical standpoint, but the settings had been configured based on standard adult parameters rather than the specific needs of a pediatric patient with chemical-induced lung damage. The ventilation volumes and pressure settings needed to be adjusted to account for the girl's smaller lung capacity and the reduced compliance caused by her injuries. But explaining this diagnosis would require Sarah to reveal knowledge that went far beyond biomedical equipment maintenance. She would need to demonstrate understanding of pulmonary physiology, pediatric ventilation parameters, and the specific medical complications associated with chemical exposure. She would need to make recommendations about patient care that were clearly outside her official scope of responsibility. As Sarah looked at the 15-year-old patient unconscious, dependent on mechanical ventilation, surrounded by monitors displaying vital signs that indicated she was in critical condition, she faced a decision that would fundamentally alter her carefully constructed life at Metropolitan General. She could maintain her invisible persona and suggest that the medical team consult with a pulmonologist or transfer the patient to a facility with more specialized equipment. Or she could reveal her true capabilities and take action that might save the girl's life. The choice became unavoidable when the patient's oxygen saturation suddenly dropped to dangerous levels and the cardiac monitor began displaying the irregular rhythms that indicated her heart was being stressed by inadequate oxygenation. The medical team was preparing for emergency measures, including the possibility of opening the patient's chest to provide direct cardiac support, when Sarah made the decision that would change everything. "The ventilator settings are wrong for her lung pathology," Sarah said quietly, stepping forward to adjust the machine's controls. She needs pressure-controlled ventilation with longer inspiratory times to compensate for the reduced compliance from chemical injury. Dr. Foster turned to look at Sarah with surprise. How do you know about ventilator management protocols? Sarah's hands moved efficiently over the machine's controls, adjusting pressure settings, modifying breathing patterns, and fine-tuning the oxygen delivery based on the patient's specific physiological needs. Within 30 seconds of her adjustments, the patient's oxygen levels began to improve and her cardiac rhythm stabilized. Where did you learn to do that? Dr. Foster asked, staring at Sarah with a mixture of confusion and growing recognition that something significant had just occurred. Sarah looked at the young patient, whose vital signs were now stabilizing as the properly configured ventilator provided the respiratory support she needed. Then, she looked at Dr. Foster, knowing that her answer would end 3 years of invisibility and force her to confront truths about herself that she had been avoiding. I was a combat medic, Sarah said simply. Medic 7 designation. 7 years in Afghanistan and Iraq. The words hung in the air of the ICU like a revelation that changed the meaning of everything that had come before. Dr. Foster stared at Sarah, processing the implications of what she had just learned. Around them, the sounds of the hospital continued, monitors beeping, ventilators cycling, nurses moving efficiently between patients, but something fundamental had shifted in that moment. The silence that followed Sarah's revelation lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Dr. Foster stared at her with widening eyes, processing the implications of what she had just witnessed. Around them, the ICU continued its rhythmic symphony of medical equipment, but something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between the doctor and the woman she had always assumed was just another hospital technician. Medic 7? Dr. Foster repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. That's the highest level of combat medical certification. You've treated battlefield trauma? Sarah nodded, her attention focused on the monitors displaying the 15-year-old patient's improving vital signs. The ventilator adjustments were working perfectly, providing the precise respiratory support the girl needed while her chemically damaged lungs worked to heal. But Sarah was acutely aware that her moment of professional invisibility had ended, and she would now have to navigate the complex consequences of revealing her true background. Dr. Foster's mind was racing as she tried to reconcile this new information with everything she thought she knew about Sarah Chen. The quiet biomedical technician who fixed equipment and maintained professional distance had just demonstrated advanced knowledge of critical care medicine that surpassed what many physicians possessed. The implications were staggering, not just for their current emergency but for the 3 years that Sarah had been working at Metropolitan General. We need to talk, Dr. Foster said, but before she could continue, her attention was pulled away by an urgent call from the emergency department. Another wave of patients from the chemical plant explosion was arriving, including several children who had been exposed to toxic gases while playing in a park downwind from the industrial complex. Sarah understood that the conversation would have to wait, but she also knew that word of what had happened in the ICU would spread rapidly through the hospital. Medical facilities were communities where information traveled quickly, especially information that challenged people's fundamental assumptions about their colleagues and the institutional hierarchy they worked within. Over the next hour, as Sarah continued her equipment maintenance rounds, she noticed subtle changes in how people interacted with her. Nurses who had previously offered polite professional greetings now looked at her with curious expressions, as if trying to see something they had missed before. Technicians who had worked alongside her for years began asking questions about her background with a new intensity that made it clear the story of the ICU incident was spreading throughout the hospital. The transformation became more obvious when Patricia Henley, the veteran ICU nurse, approached Sarah in the hallway between the cardiac unit and the emergency department. Patricia had heard about the ventilator incident from Dr. Foster, and she wanted to understand how a biomedical technician had known how to save a critically ill patient when the medical team was struggling with the case. Dr. Foster told me what happened with the Peterson girl, Patricia said, referring to the 15-year-old patient who was now stable thanks to Sarah's intervention. She said you adjusted the ventilator settings based on knowledge of chemical lung injury. That's not something they teach in biomedical engineering programs. Sarah had anticipated this conversation, but she still felt unprepared for the directness of Patricia's questions. The nurse had spent 15 years in intensive care, and she had developed the ability to read people and situations with remarkable accuracy. There would be no deflecting or minimizing the significance of what had happened. "I had medical training before I became a technician," Sarah said carefully, trying to find a way to acknowledge the truth without revealing more than necessary about her military experience. "What kind of medical training?" Patricia pressed, her expression indicating that she wasn't satisfied with vague explanations. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would fundamentally alter her relationship not just with Patricia but with everyone at Metropolitan General who learned about her background. "I was a combat medic with the Army. Served 7 years in Afghanistan and Iraq. I have experience treating trauma cases, managing respiratory emergencies, and working with limited resources under extreme conditions." Patricia stared at Sarah for a long moment, her experienced eyes taking in this information and connecting it to hundreds of small observations she had made over the years about Sarah's unusual competence and intuitive understanding of medical equipment. "Combat medic," Patricia repeated slowly. "And you've been working as a biomedical technician for 3 years, watching us struggle with cases that you could probably handle better than most of our residents." The statement hung between them, loaded with implications that neither woman was quite ready to fully address. Sarah had indeed been watching medical personnel struggle with situations that her military training had prepared her to handle, but explaining why she had chosen to remain silent would require her to confront aspects of her transition from military to civilian life that she had been avoiding. Before Sarah could respond, her emergency pager buzzed with another urgent call. This time, the alert was coming from the emergency department, where the latest wave of patients was creating new challenges that stretched the hospital's capacity even further. Sarah excused herself from the conversation with Patricia, but she knew that the questions about her background were far from over. The emergency department had been transformed into something resembling a military field hospital. Treatment areas had been established in corridors, administrative offices, and any space large enough to accommodate a gurney and the necessary medical equipment. The latest group of patients included several children who had been playing in Riverside Park when the wind shifted and carried toxic gases from the chemical plant explosion into the residential areas surrounding the facility. Dr. Webb, the chief of emergency medicine, was coordinating treatment priorities from his command post when he spotted Sarah entering the department with her equipment maintenance kit. He had heard about the ICU incident from Dr. Foster, and he was beginning to understand that the hospital's quiet biomedical technician might possess capabilities that could be invaluable during the current crisis. "Chen," Dr. Webb called out, using the formal tone that indicated he was operating in emergency command mode. "I need to talk with you about your background." Sarah approached the command post, aware that this conversation would likely determine how she would be utilized for the remainder of the emergency response. Dr. Webb was known for his direct approach to problem solving and his ability to quickly assess people and situations under pressure. She knew he would want specific information about her capabilities and experience. "Dr. Foster told me about the ventilator situation in the ICU," Dr. Webb said without preamble. "She also mentioned that you have military medical training. I need to know exactly what your qualifications are and whether you can assist with patient care during this emergency." Sarah had reached the moment she had been dreading and anticipating for 3 years. The careful barriers between her past and present were collapsing, and she would need to decide how much of her true capability she was willing to reveal and what role she was prepared to play in the current crisis. "I'm a certified combat medic with 7 years of active duty experience," Sarah said, meeting Dr. Webb's direct gaze. "Medic 7 designation, which means I've trained in advanced trauma life support, emergency surgical procedures, mass casualty triage, and field medical command. I've treated everything from blast injuries to chemical exposure to complex multi-trauma cases under combat conditions." Dr. Webb absorbed this information while mentally calculating how Sarah's skills could be integrated into the hospital's emergency response. The Medic 7 designation was something he recognized from his own military experience as a Navy flight surgeon early in his medical career. It represented a level of training and experience that was rare even among civilian emergency medical personnel. "Why are you working as a biomedical technician?" Dr. Webb asked, the question that everyone would inevitably want answered. Sarah had prepared for this question, but she still found it difficult to articulate the complex reasons that had led her to choose invisibility over utilizing her advanced medical training. Transitioning from military to civilian medicine is complicated, she said carefully. The certification processes, the institutional differences, the adjustment period after deployment. Working as a technician allowed me to stay connected to medical care while I figured out how to apply my experience in a civilian context. Dr. Webb nodded, understanding more than Sarah realized about the challenges that military medical personnel faced when returning to civilian life. He had seen other combat medics struggle with the transition, often choosing indirect paths back into medical practice rather than immediately pursuing the clinical roles their training had prepared them for. Right now, I don't care about your reasons, Dr. Webb said with the practical focus that had made him an effective emergency medicine chief. I care about your capabilities and whether you're willing to help us save lives. We have more critical patients than we can handle, and if you have the skills to assist with medical care, I need you to use them. Sarah looked around the chaotic emergency department, taking in the dozens of patients receiving treatment, the medical staff working beyond their normal capacity, and the equipment challenges that were testing every system in the hospital. This was exactly the type of situation her military training had prepared her for in mass casualty events where resources were limited and decisions had to be made quickly based on medical priorities rather than administrative procedures. I can help, Sarah said simply, the words carrying the weight of 7 years of experience treating trauma under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Dr. Webb immediately began integrating Sarah into the emergency response structure. Her first assignment was to work with Dr. Foster in treating the children who had been exposed to toxic gases from the chemical plant explosion. These cases required understanding of pediatric physiology, chemical exposure protocols, and respiratory emergency management, exactly the type of complex medical challenges that Sarah's Medic 7 training had prepared her to handle. As Sarah moved toward the treatment area where the affected children were being evaluated, she passed groups of hospital staff who were watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to amazement. Word of her military medical background was spreading rapidly through the facility, and people were beginning to reassess everything they thought they knew about the quiet technician who had been working among them for 3 years. Jake Martinez, her colleague from the biomedical department, stopped her near the pediatric treatment area with an expression of complete bewilderment. Sarah, is it true that you're actually a doctor or something? He asked, clearly struggling to reconcile his understanding of her role with the stories he was hearing about her medical qualifications. I'm not a doctor, Sarah said, trying to maintain some connection to the professional identity she had established at Metropolitan General. I'm a medic with advanced training. There's a difference. But, even as she said it, Sarah knew that the distinction was becoming less important than the reality of what she was capable of contributing during the current emergency. Her military medical training had included many procedures and decision-making responsibilities that exceeded what civilian paramedics or even some physicians routinely performed. The Medic 7 designation represented a level of medical expertise that was designed to function independently in situations where traditional medical supervision and support were unavailable. As Sarah entered the pediatric treatment area and began evaluating the children who had been exposed to toxic chemicals, she felt a familiar sense of purpose and clarity that she had been missing during her 3 years as a biomedical technician. This was the work she had been trained to do, the application of medical knowledge and skill that had given meaning to her military service and that she had been deliberately avoiding since her transition to civilian life. The first child she examined was an 8-year-old boy named Marcus who had been playing on the playground equipment when the toxic cloud reached Riverside Park. He was conscious but having difficulty breathing, and his parents were standing nearby with expressions of terror as they watched their son struggle with each breath. Sarah immediately recognized the signs of chemical irritation to the respiratory system, a condition she had treated numerous times when soldiers had been exposed to various toxic agents during combat operations. Working alongside Dr. Foster, Sarah began implementing treatment protocols that drew on both her military experience and the hospital's available resources. The combination of her field medical expertise and the advanced equipment available at Metropolitan General created opportunities for treatment approaches that neither could have achieved independently. As they worked together to stabilize Marcus and the other affected children, Dr. Foster found herself deferring to Sarah's clinical judgment in ways that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier. Sarah's understanding of chemical exposure, her experience with pediatric emergency medicine, and her ability to make rapid decisions under pressure were proving invaluable in managing cases that pushed the limits of the emergency department's capabilities. The transformation in Sarah's role was happening so rapidly that she barely had time to process the psychological implications. After 3 years of carefully maintaining professional invisibility, she was suddenly at the center of critical medical decision-making, utilizing skills and knowledge that she had spent considerable effort to keep hidden from her colleagues. But, as she worked to save the lives of children who had been caught in an industrial disaster beyond their control, Sarah began to remember why she had chosen military medical service in the first place, and why her transition to civilian life had felt so incomplete despite her efforts to find satisfaction in her role as a biomedical technician. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Metropolitan General Hospital had become something entirely different from the orderly medical facility it had been that morning. The chemical plant explosion had transformed the institution into a combat medical operation, with treatment areas established throughout the building and medical personnel pushed beyond their normal operational limits. At the center of this transformation was Sarah Chan, who had evolved from invisible technician to indispensable medical leader in the span of a few hours. The change had begun when Dr. Webb assigned Sarah to work with Dr. Foster on the pediatric chemical exposure cases, but it had accelerated rapidly as word of her capabilities spread throughout the hospital. Nurses began asking for her opinion on complex cases, residents sought her guidance on trauma procedures they had never encountered, and even senior physicians found themselves consulting with the woman they had previously known only as the quiet biomedical technician. Sarah's first major test as a medical leader came when a new wave of patients arrived from a secondary explosion at the chemical plant. The latest casualties included several plant workers who had been trapped in a storage facility when toxic chemicals ignited, creating a combination of severe burns, chemical exposure, and blast injuries that represented some of the most challenging trauma cases the hospital had ever received. The lead patient was Maria Santos, a 34-year-old chemical engineer who had been caught in the blast while attempting to shut down the facility's safety systems. She had sustained burns over 40% of her body, inhaled superheated gases that had damaged her airway, and suffered internal injuries from the pressure wave of the explosion. Her condition was so critical that the trauma team was struggling to prioritize which life-threatening problems to address first. Dr. Webb pulled Sarah into the trauma bay where Maria was being treated, recognizing that her military experience with blast injuries and chemical exposure could be crucial for developing an effective treatment strategy. What he hadn't anticipated was how naturally Sarah would assume a leadership role in coordinating the complex medical response that Maria's case required. Multiple system trauma with chemical and thermal components, Sarah said, quickly assessing Maria's condition while the trauma team worked around her. We need to secure the airway first because of the inhalation injury, but the chemical burns are creating fluid shifts that will complicate anesthesia. We'll need to coordinate respiratory, surgical, and chemical exposure protocols simultaneously. Dr. Foster, who was leading the trauma response, looked at Sarah with growing respect for her clinical judgment. What do you recommend for airway management with chemical burns to the throat? Sarah's answer drew on experience treating soldiers who had been caught in chemical weapons attacks and fuel fires, situations that civilian medical personnel rarely encountered but that had been routine challenges during her military service. Awake fiber optic intubation if possible, but be prepared for emergency surgical airway if the chemical damage is too extensive for traditional intubation. The chemical burns will continue to swell for the next few hours, so whatever airway access we establish now needs to be sustainable for at least 6 to 8 hours. As Sarah outlined her treatment recommendations, the trauma team began implementing procedures that combined her combat medical experience with the advanced resources available at Metropolitan General. The result was a level of coordinated care that exceeded what either military or civilian medicine could have achieved independently. But managing Maria's medical care was only part of the challenge Sarah found herself facing. The hospital's emergency response was beginning to strain under the accumulation of complex cases, and the institutional systems that normally coordinated care were struggling to adapt to the unprecedented demands being placed on them. Sarah recognized the signs of organizational overload from her military experience managing field hospitals during major combat operations. When medical facilities were pushed beyond their designed capacity, the breakdown rarely occurred in dramatic ways. Instead, small inefficiencies accumulated into larger problems, communication between departments became fragmented, and critical decisions were delayed while personnel tried to follow standard procedures that weren't designed for crisis situations. Dr. Webb was experiencing exactly these challenges as he attempted to coordinate the hospital's response from his command post. He was receiving reports from multiple departments about resource shortages, staffing limitations, and equipment problems that were creating bottlenecks throughout the facility. The administrative systems that worked efficiently under normal conditions were becoming obstacles to effective crisis management. Sarah approached Dr. Webb during a brief lull in patient arrivals, carrying a notepad filled with observations she had made while moving throughout the hospital during the past several hours. "We're developing systemic problems that are going to compromise patient care if we don't address them soon," she said, presenting her analysis with the directness she had learned during military briefings. "The ICU is at capacity, but we have patients in the emergency department who need intensive care. The surgical suites are backed up because we don't have enough recovery beds. And the pharmacy is running low on several critical medications because our normal supply chains weren't designed for mass casualty events." Dr. Webb looked at Sarah's notes, which contained detailed recommendations for restructuring patient flow, reallocating resources, and modifying protocols to maintain effective care despite the extraordinary circumstances. Her analysis reflected the kind of comprehensive operational thinking that was essential for managing complex medical operations but that few personnel possessed. "These are command-level observations, Dr. Webb said, recognizing the sophistication of Sarah's operational analysis. "You're thinking about this crisis like a military medical officer, not just a clinician." Sarah nodded, acknowledging that her approach to the emergency was indeed drawing on leadership experience she had gained during her military service. The Medic 7 designation hadn't just represented advanced clinical skills, it had also included training in medical command and control, resource allocation, and operational planning for complex medical missions. "I commanded a forward surgical team for 2 years in Afghanistan," Sarah explained. "We routinely handled mass casualty events with limited resources and no backup support. The principles of crisis medical management are similar whether you're operating in a combat zone or dealing with an industrial disaster." Dr. Webb made a decision that would fundamentally alter how Metropolitan General responded to the chemical plant explosion crisis. Rather than continuing to manage the emergency through the hospital's traditional administrative hierarchy, he appointed Sarah as the Deputy Incident Commander for Medical Operations, giving her authority to coordinate patient care and resource allocation throughout the facility. The appointment was unprecedented in the hospital's history. Sarah had no official medical staff privileges, no administrative authority within the institution's hierarchy, and had been working as a biomedical technician just hours earlier. But Dr. Webb recognized that her combination of clinical expertise and operational leadership experience was exactly what the crisis required. Sarah's first action in her new role was to establish a medical triage system that prioritized patients based on the severity of their injuries, the resources required for treatment, and the likelihood of successful outcomes. This approach was standard procedure in military medicine but represented a significant departure from the hospital's normal practice of treating patients based on arrival time and available bed space. The new triage system required Sarah to make decisions about patient care that would directly affect treatment outcomes and survival rates. She had to determine which patients would receive immediate access to the ICU, which cases could be managed with alternative care approaches, and which patients should be transferred to other facilities despite the risks associated with transport during their critical phase of treatment. These were exactly the types of decisions that Sarah had been trained to make during her military service, but implementing them in a civilian hospital environment created ethical and practical challenges that she hadn't anticipated. Unlike combat medicine, where resource limitations and battlefield conditions created clear parameters for decision-making, the civilian medical system operated under different assumptions about patient care standards and treatment obligations. Sarah's most difficult decision involved 2 patients who arrived simultaneously, both requiring immediate access to the hospital's single remaining ICU bed. The first patient was Robert Chen, a 68-year-old man who had suffered a heart attack while evacuating his home near the chemical plant. His condition was critical, but his age and underlying health problems made his long-term prognosis uncertain. The second patient was Jennifer Walsh, a 23-year-old plant worker who had severe chemical burns and respiratory damage but was young and healthy enough that aggressive treatment could potentially save her life. In military medicine, Sarah would have made this decision based on triage protocols that prioritized patients with the best chances of survival and return to function. But, in the civilian hospital environment, she had to consider family expectations, legal obligations, and institutional policies that complicated the purely medical aspects of treatment allocation. Sarah consulted with Dr. Webb and the hospital's ethics committee, but ultimately the decision was hers to make as the deputy incident commander for medical operations. She chose to admit Jennifer Walsh to the ICU while arranging for Robert Chan to receive intensive monitoring and care in a converted treatment area staffed with additional nursing support. The decision reflected the kind of clinical judgment that Sarah had been making for 7 years during her military service, but implementing it at Metropolitan General required her to explain her reasoning to families, medical staff, and administrators who weren't familiar with mass casualty triage protocols. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself coordinating medical care throughout the hospital while simultaneously managing the operational challenges created by the unprecedented patient load. She worked with the pharmacy to prioritize medication distribution, collaborated with the respiratory therapy department to optimize ventilator utilization, and established communication protocols that kept all departments informed about resource availability and patient status changes. The most rewarding aspect of her expanded role was the opportunity to mentor other medical personnel who were encountering trauma cases and emergency procedures outside their normal experience. Dr. Foster had never treated chemical exposure cases before the current crisis, but working with Sarah provided her with intensive training in recognizing and managing the complex medical complications associated with toxic chemical exposure. Similarly, several of the ICU nurses were learning advanced procedures for managing blast injury patients, techniques that they would never have encountered during their normal civilian practice but that were essential for providing optimal care during the current emergency. Patricia Henley, the veteran ICU nurse, became one of Sarah's most valuable collaborators in implementing the modified care protocols that the crisis required. Patricia's 15 years of intensive care experience, combined with Sarah's military medical background, created a partnership that enabled them to manage complex cases that neither could have handled independently. "I've been working in intensive care for 15 years, Patricia told Sarah during a brief break between patient care activities, and I've learned more about emergency medicine in the past 6 hours than I learned in the previous 6 months. You have a way of explaining complex procedures that makes them seem manageable, even under these conditions." Sarah's ability to teach and lead under pressure was drawing on skills she had developed while training other combat medics during her military service. The Medic 7 program had included extensive instruction in medical education and leadership, preparing senior medics to function as teachers and mentors for junior personnel who were encountering combat medical challenges for the first time. As evening approached, Metropolitan General had successfully treated more than 70 patients from the chemical plant explosion, a caseload that would have overwhelmed the facility under normal operational procedures. The success was largely attributable to the modified protocols and resource allocation strategies that Sarah had implemented, approaches that drew on military medical doctrine but were adapted to the capabilities and constraints of the civilian hospital environment. But the personal cost of Sarah's transformation from invisible technician to medical leader was becoming increasingly apparent. She had spent 3 years carefully avoiding the responsibilities and emotional demands associated with high-stakes medical decision-making, and the sudden return to that role was forcing her to confront aspects of her military experience that she had been deliberately suppressing. The decisions she was making about patient care, resource allocation, and treatment priorities were remarkably similar to the choices she had faced during her military service, when soldiers' lives depended on her clinical judgment and leadership capabilities. The familiarity of the decision-making process was both empowering and emotionally challenging, bringing back memories and responsibilities that she had worked hard to leave behind. As the sun set over Metropolitan General Hospital, casting long shadows across the emergency department that had been transformed into a trauma center, Sarah Chen found herself standing at the nurse's station reviewing patient charts and coordinating the overnight care protocols for the chemical plant explosion victims. 24 hours earlier, she had been an invisible biomedical technician whose most significant decision involved prioritizing equipment maintenance schedules. Now she was the Deputy Incident Commander for Medical Operations, responsible for coordinating the care of more than 70 patients whose lives depended on the decisions she was making. The transformation had happened so rapidly that Sarah barely had time to process its psychological implications. For 3 years, she had carefully constructed a professional identity that allowed her to remain connected to medical care while avoiding the intense responsibility and emotional demands that had characterized her military service. The quiet, predictable routine of biomedical maintenance had provided her with a sense of purpose without requiring her to make life-or-death decisions or confront the trauma-related memories that had made her transition to civilian life so challenging. But the chemical plant explosion had shattered those carefully maintained boundaries, forcing her back into the role of medical leader and decision-maker that she had deliberately abandoned when she left military service. The irony was that her attempts to escape the responsibilities of advanced medical practice had led her to a situation where those responsibilities were more critical than they had ever been during her military career. Dr. Webb approached the nurses' station where Sarah was coordinating the overnight staffing assignments, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the exhausted expression of someone who had been managing a crisis for more than 12 hours. He had been observing Sarah's performance throughout the day, and he wanted to discuss not just the current emergency response but the longer-term implications of what had been revealed about her capabilities. "The crisis is stabilizing," Dr. Webb said, settling into the chair beside Sarah's workstation. "We've transferred the most critical patients to specialized facilities, the remaining cases are manageable with our current resources, and the last wave of patients from the chemical plant has been treated and stabilized. From an operational standpoint, this has been the most successful mass casualty response in the hospital's history." Sarah nodded, reviewing the patient status reports that showed how effectively the modified triage and care protocols had managed an unprecedented medical emergency. Every patient who could potentially be saved had received appropriate care, resource allocation had been optimized to maximize treatment effectiveness, and the hospital's systems had adapted to extraordinary demands without experiencing the organizational breakdown that often occurred during crisis situations. "The success is largely attributable to your leadership and clinical expertise," Dr. Webb continued. "Your military medical background provided exactly the kind of operational knowledge and crisis management experience that we needed to handle this emergency effectively." Sarah appreciated the recognition, but she was also aware that Dr. Webb was leading toward a larger conversation about her role at Metropolitan General and how the revelation of her military medical background would affect her future at the hospital. "I want to offer you a position as an attending physician in our emergency department," Dr. Webb said directly. "Your clinical skills, leadership capabilities, and crisis management experience make you exactly the kind of physician we need on our staff. I know there would be some certification and credentialing processes to complete, but your military medical training and today's performance demonstrate that you have the capabilities to function at the attending level immediately." The offer represented everything that Sarah had been avoiding since her transition to civilian life. An attending physician position would provide her with the authority and responsibility to make independent medical decisions, manage complex cases, and lead teams of medical professionals. It would be a return to the high-stakes medical practice that had given meaning to her military service but that had also been associated with traumatic experiences and emotional demands that she had struggled to manage. Sarah looked around the emergency department, observing the medical staff who had spent the day working under her guidance and the patients who had received care that exceeded what the hospital could normally provide. The success of the emergency response had demonstrated not just her individual capabilities but the potential for combining military medical expertise with civilian hospital resources to achieve outcomes that neither could accomplish independently. "I need time to consider the offer," Sarah said carefully, knowing that her answer would determine not just her immediate future but how she would integrate her military experience with her civilian life moving forward. Dr. Webb understood that Sarah's decision involved more than simply choosing between job opportunities. He had observed the psychological complexity of her transformation during the crisis, recognizing that she was wrestling with fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and how to apply her military experience in ways that were sustainable and personally meaningful. "Take the time you need," Dr. Webb said. "But I want you to know that today's performance has changed how everyone at this hospital sees you. You've demonstrated capabilities that are rare in civilian medicine, and there's an opportunity here to build something significant if you're willing to embrace it." After Dr. Webb left to continue his rounds, Sarah remained at the nurse's station, processing the events of the day and the choices she now faced. The emergency response had been professionally satisfying in ways that her work as a biomedical technician had never been, but it had also brought back memories and emotions that she had worked hard to suppress since leaving military service. Patricia Henley approached the nurse's station during her break, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who wanted to have a serious conversation about the day's events and their implications. "I've been thinking about everything that happened today," Patricia said, settling into the chair that Dr. Webb had vacated. 3 years I've worked with you, and I had no idea about your background or your capabilities. I keep wondering how many times you watched us struggle with cases that you could have handled easily if we had known who you really were." The question touched on the ethical complexity that Sarah had been grappling with throughout her 3 years at Metropolitan General. Her decision to conceal her military medical background had been motivated by personal reasons related to her transition to civilian life, but it had also meant that patients had received less optimal care than might have been possible if her expertise had been available to the medical team. "I wasn't trying to withhold help from patients," Sarah said, struggling to articulate the complicated reasoning behind her choice to work as a technician rather than pursuing a clinical role. "The transition from military to civilian medicine is more complex than most people realize. The certification processes, the institutional differences, the psychological adjustments. It seemed easier to stay connected to medical care in a support role while I figured out how to apply my experience appropriately." Patricia nodded, understanding more than Sarah might have expected about the challenges of career transitions and the psychological factors that influenced professional choices. "But today changed everything," Patricia observed. "You didn't just demonstrate that you have advanced medical skills, you showed that you're a natural leader who can coordinate complex emergency responses and make decisions that save lives under extreme pressure. Those are capabilities that this hospital needs, especially if we're going to face more emergencies like today's." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Foster, who had been working continuously for more than 18 hours and was finally taking a break to process the extraordinary day she had experienced. Her interaction with Sarah during the crisis had been professionally transformative, providing her with intensive training in emergency procedures and clinical decision-making that would influence her approach to medicine for the rest of her career. "I wanted to thank you for today," Dr. Foster said to Sarah. "Working with you has taught me more about emergency medicine than any textbook or lecture could have provided. The way you analyzed complex cases, prioritized treatment decisions, and coordinated care under pressure, it was like getting a masterclass in crisis medicine from someone who has actually faced every possible medical challenge." Sarah appreciated Dr. Foster's recognition, but she was also aware that her teaching role during the crisis had been one of the most satisfying aspects of the emergency response. Training other medical personnel, sharing knowledge gained through her military experience, and helping them develop capabilities they could apply in future challenging situations had provided her with a sense of purpose that was missing from her work as a biomedical technician. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself having similar conversations with medical staff throughout the hospital. Nurses who had worked with her during the crisis wanted to understand her background and express appreciation for the knowledge she had shared. Residents who had observed her clinical decision-making were eager to learn from her experience and understand how her military medical training had prepared her for situations they had never encountered. Even senior physicians were expressing interest in learning about the crisis management techniques and operational approaches that Sarah had implemented during the emergency response. The cumulative effect of these interactions was to make Sarah realize that her attempts to isolate her military experience from her civilian life had prevented her from contributing her most valuable capabilities to the medical community. The knowledge and skills she had gained during 7 years of combat medical service represented resources that could benefit countless patients and medical personnel, but only if she was willing to make them available through active clinical practice and medical education. But embracing that role would require Sarah to confront aspects of her military experience that she had been avoiding since her transition to civilian life. The combat medical situations that had provided her with unparalleled training had also exposed her to traumatic experiences and moral challenges that continued to influence her psychological and emotional well-being. Returning to high-stakes medical practice would mean accepting responsibility for life-or-death decisions and managing the stress and emotional demands that had been part of what made her military to civilian transition so difficult. Sarah's contemplation was interrupted by a call from the ICU, where 15-year-old Amanda Peterson, the girl whose life Sarah had saved by adjusting her ventilator settings, was waking up for the first time since the chemical plant explosion. The girl's parents had been waiting by her bedside for more than 12 hours, and the nurses wanted Sarah to be present when Amanda regained consciousness because her recovery was directly attributable to Sarah's medical intervention. Standing beside Amanda's bed, watching the teenager open her eyes and take her first independent breaths since the chemical exposure, Sarah experienced a profound sense of clarity about her choices and her future. This was why she had chosen military medical service originally, the opportunity to use advanced medical knowledge and skills to save lives and reduce suffering. The satisfaction she felt in seeing Amanda's recovery was identical to the feelings that had motivated her throughout her military career, and that had been missing from her 3 years as a biomedical technician. Amanda's mother grasped Sarah's hand, tears streaming down her face as she expressed gratitude for the medical intervention that had saved her daughter's life. The family had learned about Sarah's role in Amanda's care from Dr. Foster, and they understood that their daughter's survival was directly attributable to Sarah's military medical expertise and willingness to act beyond her official job description. "Thank you for saving our daughter," Amanda's father said, his voice breaking with emotion. Dr. Foster told us that you saw something the other doctors missed, that your experience in the military taught you how to help her when the standard treatments weren't working. As Sarah looked at Amanda, who was now breathing normally and beginning to respond to her parents' voices, she understood that her choice about Dr. Webb's offer would determine whether she would continue to have opportunities to use her medical expertise to save lives or whether she would return to the safety and limitations of her biomedical technician role. The decision represented more than simply choosing between job opportunities. It was about how she would integrate her military experience with her civilian life, whether she would allow her traumatic memories to limit her contributions to medical care, and how she would define her professional identity moving forward. Standing in the ICU, surrounded by the sophisticated medical equipment she had been maintaining for 3 years and the patients whose lives had been saved through the combination of her military expertise and the hospital's resources, Sarah made her choice. The next morning, she walked into Dr. Webb's office and accepted the position as attending physician in the emergency department. But she also proposed expanding her role to include developing crisis response protocols for the hospital, training medical staff in mass casualty management, and establishing educational programs that would share military medical knowledge with civilian healthcare providers. Sarah's transformation from invisible technician to medical leader was complete, but it represented the beginning rather than the end of her contribution to Metropolitan General Hospital. Her military experience, combined with the hospital's resources and her newfound willingness to embrace leadership responsibilities, created opportunities to improve emergency medical care not just for their facility but for the broader medical community. 6 months later, Metropolitan General had become a regional training center for crisis medical response, with Sarah leading educational programs that prepared medical personnel throughout the region for mass casualty events and complex emergency situations. Her military medical expertise was no longer hidden behind the role of biomedical technician but was being actively shared with hundreds of medical professionals who could apply that knowledge to save lives in their own communities. The Medic 7 designation that Sarah had carried silently for 3 years had become the foundation for a new model of civilian emergency medicine that combined the best aspects of military and hospital-based medical practice. And Sarah had discovered that integrating her military experience with her civilian life, rather than hiding from it, provided her with the sense of purpose and professional satisfaction that had been missing since her transition from military service. The chemical plant explosion had revealed not just Sarah's individual capabilities but the potential for military medical expertise to enhance civilian healthcare in ways that benefited entire communities. And, for Sarah, it had provided the opportunity to finally answer the question that had been troubling her since leaving military service: how to use her hard-earned medical knowledge and leadership skills to continue serving others while building a sustainable and meaningful civilian life.